Hello, and welcome to this Religion Media Centre briefing, which is being held as Americans wake up to the first full day of the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which will see Vice President Kamala Harris formally nominated as the party's presidential candidate. You'll probably have heard it said so many times in the last month about how Joe Biden's decision not to contest the election himself and his subsequent endorsement of Harris has transformed the political atmosphere in the States. So we're here today to discuss Kamala Harris's religious background and what impact that might have on the campaign, and about how her candidacy is leading religious groups in particular to reorient themselves. And we'll also hear about the non-religious groups too, who may often feel they're overlooked in this discussion. I'm delighted to have a really fantastic lineup of commentators today. And I want to apologise to them all in advance for the limited time that we have. But I hope that this event will encourage you to want to join us again as November approaches. I shall introduce our panel as I come to them in turn. And when we've heard briefly from everyone, it'll be a bit of a free-for-all, which I will attempt to moderate. Do put questions and comments in the chat box at any time, and we'll try and come to you for questions and for comments. So, challenge as to where to start, but I'm going to start with Heidi Schlump from the National Catholic Reporter, because you're there in Chicago. You were looking a little bit bleary-eyed, if you don't mind me saying, after the night before. Just tell us, what the first few hours have been like, what the feeling is there.
Good morning from Chicago. And just a small correction, we are waking up to our second day of the convention because yesterday was definitely a full day for all of us yesterday. So it's Tuesday here in Chicago. And yesterday was a full day. I will say, as a religion reporter last night during the speeches, I was having my ears tuned to see whether there was mention of religion. And there was quite a bit of mention in religion in the many speeches. And there was a lot of enthusiasm. So I covered the RMC as well in Milwaukee, which was also a very enthusiastic convention. And I was not expecting that was what it was going to be like in Chicago. But because of President Biden's decision, as you said, there's a lot of enthusiasm. I also was at one of the protests yesterday. So,
right. What's the stories that your readers at the National Catholic Reporter are going to be looking for? I suppose I'm thinking, a sort of supplementary to that, is whether it's a plus or a minus that Kamala Harris is not a Catholic, because it sort of played a bit both ways for Joe Biden, didn't it?
Yeah, so if you went to our homepage yesterday, you would see that our main story was a story looking back at Biden's Catholicism, because that was quite a story for us and for our readers over the past years, both because he was a practicing Catholic, went to church every Sunday, and drew on his faith for many of his principles and his policies. He got into trouble with the bishops over the issue of abortion, so there's plenty of conflict in that story as well. I think Kamala's religion is going to be covered very differently. Our readers are just as interested, even though she's not Catholic. So, and we were watching when she was choosing her vice presidential candidate, running mate, to see if that person might be Catholic or have Catholic connections, and several of them did. But I think the religion of the candidate is of less interest, I think, to our readers and to most Americans than to the values that their policies and they represent.
Thank you. Richie Kamarka, you're a reporter at Religion News Service, and you cover Hinduism a lot. We know Kamala Harris has got Hindu heritage, and her father was a Black Baptist from Jamaica. What opportunity do you think that gives to the US to sort of focus on its diversity rather than its, traditional Christian identity, I suppose?
Right. First of all, thank you guys so much for having me on this panel. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. At the baseline, I think someone who was raised with a Hindu mother, identifies as Baptist now, and is married to a Jewish person, I think that for many in the United States represents this kind of pluralism and democratic ethos that hasn't been seen before in a presidential candidate. And for many, at least for my beat that I cover Hinduism, many see this as kind of this perfect kind of compatibility with Hinduism and the inherent plurality that many see in the Hindu tradition, where there is not, identity can be very fluid. There's no conversion process. The general idea is that it's an open source architecture that people can pull from what they would like to. And so I think it's really interesting to first look at her mother, who, came from Tamil Nadu in India, and who, when she immigrated to the United States, she married, of course, Kamala Harris's father, who was a Black Baptist, and raised her children in both traditions, I would say. She herself converted, but she still created a reverence for Hindu temples within her children, took them to both places. And that is something that is not incompatible with the Hindu faith. That is not, it's not incompatible to be in an interfaith marriage. And it's very, very, common for many Hindus to kind of see different pathways to God, including Christianity. And I think all in all, this commitment to interfaith, identity that she has in her own life and her personal life, I think that many are seeing that this could be really such a gain for the United States, which is increasingly, we see increasing interfaith couples, marriages, families, and this really could represent something that is bigger than, the path.
I wonder, Hemant Mehta, you're a blogger and an atheist activist. I wonder whether you see in that sort of her interfaith character, whether you see that as an opportunity to just talk about the pluralism within America, including, significant numbers of people who would identify as non-religious and may feel that the whole question about the role that religion plays in politics is either overemphasized or hijacked or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of atheists, I think it's not that unusual to be surrounded by people who are religious. And if you are in a relationship or a family where it's not always in constant conflict, then you know how to navigate those areas. So like Richard was saying, when you have a Black Baptist who is married to a Jewish man who has a Lutheran running mate, it's like, yeah, that tracks. That sounds about right for what a lot of us have experienced in our own lives. And I will say, watching night one, I'm about to head over for day two to the DNC. What strikes me as kind of amazing is the fact that after so many years of what atheists have been arguing, that we have too much religion in politics, we need more separation of church and state, after the Trump years where it's really pushed upon you by his party that there is only one right way to be a Christian, there is so much pushback to the point where a lot of the talking points I would have expected to come from my side, pushing back against something like Project 2025 and the Republican playbook, that seems to not be an atheist thing anymore. That seems to be universally condemned by so many different groups that it's kind of inspiring in a way to see how many of the speakers, night one of the Democratic National Convention, were pushing back against what they believe is an intrusion of a particular type of Christianity, and saying, you know what, this doesn't represent all of us. And we are not just a group of non-religious people, because I promise you Democrats are not, but they're saying we are a party that is a big tent. We're a party that has room for everybody. You're not going to like everything, but there's a lot of room for everybody here. But the one thing that does bind us, and this is actually released yesterday in the Democratic Party's platform, is a commitment to church-state separation. Even today, before the nightly speakers that you might see everywhere, they are actually putting a lot of resources into the interfaith groups, into including secular voices in those interfaith groups. And again, that's the sort of thing that I know on my side of the fence we've been pushing for a long time. Like, listen to us. We, the non-religious voters, are a big part of the Democratic base, and they kind of held us at arm's length. And this year, more than other years, it seems like they're welcoming us into the fold and actually using many of those arguments, again, not pro-atheist, but a general plurality, religious freedom argument in speeches from no matter who's doing the talking. It's kind of amazing.
I just wonder, we know that there's been a great excitement since Joe Biden decided not to stand, but the sort of energy we've seen among religious constituencies, isn't it a bit sobering that if that wasn't there before. Dr. Deckman, Melissa Deckman, you're the Chief Executive of the Public Religion Research Institute. I wonder if you could just comment a little bit about what you've seen in the last month about the reinvigoration of religious constituencies and whether they were there and not being heard, or whether they're shouting louder. What's happening?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting in looking at everything that everyone has said so far. I think I really agree with. I think Kamala Harris really embodies this religious pluralism, a commitment to a diverse country that you just simply don't see on the Republican side. I also agree that there's been a lot of emphasis on Project 2025, which is really a Christian nationalist blueprint for what many Republicans would like to put into policy if Trump is reelected. And so I think, again, there's a clear sense that among Democrats that, we need to have the separation of church and state. We can't have one form of Christianity rule the country. And I think that's really notable. In terms of exciting the base from a religious perspective, I think we need to remember that even though in the Democratic Party base, we find about roughly 30% or so of Democrats are religiously unaffiliated, we still find that 70% of Democrats identify with some religion and 60% are still Christian. That includes, of course, far more Christians of color, African Americans, Black Protestants, Hispanic, Latino Catholics, and Protestants as well. And so, again, I think it's often a misnomer to think that the Democratic Party is completely secular. It's not. In fact, it's very religiously diverse. Now, I think one question going forward is, will, for example, Kamala Harris be able to make inroads to maybe more traditionally Republican constituencies like white evangelicals, right? There was a Zoom call where evangelicals for Harris had a call and we're trying to kind of raise attention to their constituency and their values and their beliefs. I think in reality, white evangelical Protestants are very much one of the staunchest Republican groups in the country. I don't anticipate that a Harris Walz ticket is going to necessarily bring white evangelicals back to be voting for the Democratic Party come November. But again, I just think it serves as a reminder when it comes to religion and the election that really Harris brings this remarkable pluralistic view of what religion can entail. And so I think in some ways, she's talking about in the selection of Tim Walz, a Minnesota Lutheran, which is a new term to me. I guess I'm not from Minnesota, but this idea that, there are certainly good values, social justice values that stem from their religious faith that I think Democrats are not elected to talk about. So in that way, maybe we're talking more about religion and politics.
I think Reverend Canon Broderick Greer's here, and he's canon presenter at St. John's Cathedral in Denver. I think you're also in Chicago, Broderick. Welcome. I know that you have been in touch with the evangelicals for Harris, and I just wonder, in the UK, evangelicals does mean something a little bit different from what it means in the States, where it's much more of a sort of political designation. I wonder whether there's a sort of move to reclaim the word evangelicals for the religious, or for other groups of evangelicals other than the Trump evangelicals that we have heard so much from.
Thank you so much for this question, Rosie, and hello to you. It's good to see you, and also to the Reverend Senator Kim Jackson, a good friend for a very long time. God bless you. It's good to be with all of you. It was fascinating yesterday. I just happened to be volunteering on one of the media teams at the convention and ran into Lisa Sharon Harper from Evangelicals for Harris. And it was great talking to Lisa. She's a longtime evangelical activist, justice activist. And I remember there was some presser that was given out a few weeks ago that said essentially that obviously a presidential candidate does not need 100% of white evangelicals to vote for them in order to win. But there's a margin where they need between about 15 to 20% at least in order to win nationally. And apparently that was the case with W. Bush, with Obama, with Trump, with Biden, and obviously now Harris. And I think, obviously, white evangelicals, religious people of all stripes are not monolithic in the way that they vote. Black Christians, a tradition that birthed me, vote in overwhelming numbers and have for over 60 years for Democrats. That is a group of people that is not historically covered or really understood by mainstream media. They tend to have more conservative social values, but that does not in any way deter them, or at least a majority of them, from not voting for Democrats. But in terms of white evangelicals, there is this sense among a minority of them that Donald Trump does not represent their values, values that they find in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, values that they find in the teachings of Jesus, and that the Democratic Party in some way reflects those values more faithfully than the Republican Party.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And this is a good point to bring in Senator Kim Jackson, who is both a state senator in Georgia and an Episcopalian priest. It's really lovely to have you with us, Senator. And I'm just wondering about how you straddle, not necessarily divide, but, you've got two constituencies here overlapping. You've got your the people in your church. You've got the people that you want to vote Democrat, and you've got people who already do. I mean, is there, when you're talking about the election, how much are you using the language of Jesus that Broderick was just using, and how much are you using other language? And is there any sort of, do you have to be a little bit careful about that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that question. So I will say, because I'm an Episcopal priest, I probably get the question about Jesus's values more often than I think traditional candidates do, or traditional sitting senators. And so I do find myself using language about Jesus, talking about the way he lived. I always like to give this example. In Georgia, we have lots of issues around who can get access to food. We have a program called SNAP, or food stamps. And I always give the example of, like, Jesus, there were 5,000 people gathered together. None of them were working. No papers were required, and they all got to eat. That's the Jesus that I'm following. And so I'm therefore not voting to install or institute work requirements in order for you to get food benefits, right? But I think it's honestly, I only respond in that way because people come with that question to me. Typically, I am very careful. I very much value the importance of the separation of church and state. And I think that it's very easy for me as a senator to articulate values, all right? Values that aren't necessarily directly, I don't have to use the name of Jesus to talk about those values, right? But people are always really curious, right? I am in the South. I'm a Black woman in the South. And so people assume that I am a Christian, and they want to know, like, how do you make this work? How do you make your faith reconcile with the Democratic Party's position on abortion? How do you make your faith reconcile with any number of things in the Democratic platform? I get those questions a lot. And so I often come and respond in that way. But the last thing I will say is that I never, I'm very careful about when I'm in the well, like when I'm actually on the floor speaking as a senator, doing the proceedings. I'm very careful not to bring religious language. I bring values, but not explicitly religious languages into that space, because that's my boundary. I think that's a part of respecting the separation of church and state.
I will just ask you briefly about the situation in Georgia, because, I mean, those of us over here might remember that Joe Biden won that state. I think it was about less than 12,000 votes between him and Donald Trump. The Republicans claimed that the votes had been rigged, and there was a problem with voter registration, false registration. Since then, the Republicans have passed a law which actually has disenfranchised a lot of, predominantly, I think, Black voters. I mean, what are your fears going into this coming election about how that might play out?
Yeah, sure. I'll make a little adjustment there. I think they passed a law where they attempted to disenfranchise Black voters, but Black voters have been incredible. Organizers on the ground have really worked hard to get over those hurdles. People literally bought printers that were mobile printers so that they could go to people's homes and print out the paperwork for them, so that voters would not be disenfranchised. But there certainly has been an attempt there. We're scared. I mean, I will tell you, Rosie, I was not not even an elected official in 2020 when Donald Trump lost the election in Georgia. And yet I still get hate mail to this day as if I were a part of that process. And so we are concerned that if Donald Trump doesn't win Georgia, which we are trending in the direction where Harris will win, that there will be protests and possibly violence seen against legislators. And we've already had briefings to prepare us for ways to protect ourselves and our families. So it is of grave concern for us. And a part of my job has been to try to reassure people, everybody, regardless of party, is that Georgia's elections are secure. They are secure. There is not fraud in the system. And my Republican colleagues continue to pass more and more rules, more and more laws to secure it even more. It's very secure. So when Harris wins in Georgia, we need to accept those results. And I'm very, very much prepared. And I think we all are prepared for the possibility of actual violence in Georgia should Trump not win.
Okay, thank you. Well, the only person I think I've not come to yet is Alan Koopman from the Pew Institute. Thanks for being so patient in waiting. But I thought we'd hear a little bit from the ground first. But I mean, you've looked at polls over years. You've seen, I suppose, what's happened to the polls over the last month since Kamala Harris effectively became the Democrat nominee. What are you looking for in the polls, because we know how fickle they are, which will tell you the way things are heading and the challenges that Democrats and Republicans are going to have to get their candidate in the White House?
Well, thank you, Rosie. Thank you so much for hosting this great conversation. There are a couple of things we're looking for. One question that people always are interested in is, what about the relatively small number of undecided voters, and which way will they turn? But I think in many ways, the bigger question and the big effect that Joe Biden stepping aside and Kamala Harris entering the race has had is to energize the voters who are already on one side or the other. So, and in fact, sort of enthusiasm as opposed to support. So when we think about polling, we think about those two factors. Who are people supporting and how enthusiastic are they about the candidate they support? That enthusiasm is really important because it's a good indicator of who will actually turn out to vote. And in many ways, this is a classic statement, but very true in this election. The election is very likely to turn not just on who supports which candidate, but on which voters turn out and which party is more successful at turning out its base. So we've seen a huge move, not so much in the religious coalitions and whom they support. Those are very consistent with the past, but in enthusiasm. And enthusiasm among Democratic voters for Kamala Harris has jumped like 20 points. It was about low 40s of Democratic voters who said they strongly supported Joe Biden, and we got in the mid 60s now for Kamala Harris. And in particular, the constituencies that have really moved are younger voters, Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters, and women voters. And for anybody who looks at Kamala Harris, it's not surprising. She's younger than Joe Biden, she's more female than Joe Biden, and she's more a person of color than Joe Biden, to state the obvious. So she has moved those. Now, as far as religion goes, and I appreciate that this is mostly conversation you want to talk about religion and its role. And I think religion always plays a role in these campaigns, but I think there is sometimes we could overstate its role. Because if we look at the religious constituencies, they're still very much where they have been in past elections. So I listened very carefully to what my colleagues said about evangelicals for Harris, and there certainly are white evangelicals who support Harris, but it's at this moment about 15% of white evangelicals who support Harris. 77% support Trump. And interestingly, there's a good share there that are thinking about third-party candidates, still like Kennedy or others. One of the other things that's happened, by the way, is that a lot of Kamala Harris's gains have actually come out of the third-party party candidates rather than Donald Trump. And to be, even-handed about all this, one should recognize in the polling that the number of Republicans or the percentage of Republicans who strongly support Trump has also risen. So both parties are sort of reaching this crescendo or moving up in this crescendo of enthusiasm for their candidates, which again is not surprising. That's happened in past elections. I don't see any major religious constituency on which we have good data that is leaning in a considerably different way than it has in the past 4 or 5 elections. So white evangelical Protestants are still leaning strongly Republican. Religiously unaffiliated people are still leaning strongly Democratic, as Bronner Greer said. Black Protestants are still leaning strongly Democratic, and so on. There is one group that's somewhat in play, and it's also really tricky for all of us who are engaged in polling because we just don't have good data on it, and that's Muslim Americans, who consistently have been strongly Democratic voters. Where they will go in this election, nobody really knows. And honestly, getting a good national representative sample of Muslims who represent about 1% of the U.S. population is really tough. And anybody who tells you they know where Muslim voters are, they don't know. I mean, they know it maybe anecdotally. They may be talking with their groups, the community.
And I know some people think Tim Walz might appeal particularly to Muslims. I mean, is it very briefly, Alan? Is the Muslim vote enough anywhere to actually make a significant difference?
Yes and no. There's a bit of a fallacy in thinking about elections this way. When an election is super, super close, any group can be seen as flipping the election one way or the other way. And so at the end of the day, it's entirely possible to look back on this election and say that in 1 or 2 states, if 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 voters had gone the other way, it would have made the difference. But the fallacy is thinking that if that group moves, everything else stayed the same. I mean, the election is on a teeter-totter, right? But only because all these other groups are where they are. And the reality is that no one group moves alone. So yes and no.
Thank you. Now, everybody do indicate if you'd like to come in and pick up any points that your colleagues have made or add a new point. I'm just going to sort of throw some questions around to individuals that I'm interested in, but do please guide the conversation yourselves. I want to come to Melissa because, Melissa, you've done a lot of work about Gen Z and how they're shaping up in these elections, particularly what's happening with the women's vote and what that means. Is that something that should scare the Republicans, for instance?
Yeah, this election, I think, is really shaping up to be one about gender in ways that we haven't seen really before. We know historically, if you look back at the polling, women tend to vote Democratic, men tend to vote Republican. But within those groups, of course, white women voters have turned Republican, for example. We know that women of color, staunchly Democratic. But what's really fascinating is looking at younger voters. What we've seen among Gen Z is that Gen Z women have become staunchly progressive and feminist. In the last election for the House, for example, for the generic House ballot, exit polls showed that 72% of Gen Z women voted for Democratic candidates for the House, right? They are a powerful force. They vote in larger numbers than their male counterparts. And it was really a direct reflection of the Dobbs decision. Now, I have a book now out about Gen Z women, and really there's a palpable sense among this generation of women that their rights are in jeopardy. They were fearful of it during the Trump administration. Roe was overturned. And so you do see this galvanizing force among younger women that is going to lead them to vote Democratic. The flip side, however, is that we've seen some data showing that young men are trending more conservative. And the Republican Party has really made a play for young male voters going to the manosphere, having Donald Trump appear on these really conservative right-wing shows in an attempt to really try to get young men voters who might feel as though women's gains in society have come at their loss. And so this idea of, you see all these really tropes of hypermasculinity on the Republican side, right? I mean, I think it's notable that who introduced Donald Trump at the convention last month was, the head of the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which has a very large base of young male viewers, right? And so the way that gender is being navigated in this election is really, really fascinating and something to really watch. But I will say this. With the nomination now of Harris in the Walz ticket, we have seen some of those. We saw some potential gains of Trump making inroads to young men of color, for example. I think that has kind of gone back to more normal voting patterns here. So the inroads that Trump is making, I think, with young men is probably going to be with young white men moving forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I did a piece where I looked at young Catholic voters and their support for the Harris-Walz ticket. And what was interesting to me, there was a gender component in that women were very excited. But what was interesting to me was their enthusiasm for this ticket, despite the abortion issue. So often the issue of abortion is used in Catholic and evangelical circles, and in white evangelical and white Catholic circles, we have a lot of similar trends going on to say that you cannot vote for this ticket, that you can only vote Republican or you're not a Catholic voter. And many of the people that I interviewed were not super progressive Catholics. One said she attended a Latin mass. So generally an indicator of someone being pretty traditional. The abortion issue might be important for them, but it's secondary. And so
secondary to what, I suppose?
Well, for example, many of them, it's about the concerns about democracy. But for some of them, it's and there was a lot of enthusiasm, I have to say, more for Walz even maybe than for Harris, because he's seen as this progressive who provides things like free school lunches, tuition assistance, and all these values that they believe, like another guest had said, come from Jesus and from their Christian faith. So I think it'll be interesting to see what younger voters do, but also the gender component of women. So white Catholic women, white evangelical women. It is true that it's very hard to peel off an evangelical voter from the Republican Party who's very committed to those principles, especially if for them abortion is a big issue. But I think there is a potential with women in those groups.
Just a really quick point there. I think, Heidi, I agree with everything she said. I think the other thing to think about with Gen Z in particular is that this is an incredibly diverse generation. Only 1 in 2 Gen Zers are white. But they also care a lot about immigration. And I think that they see really this very strident talk about mass deportation of immigrants. This is really affecting Gen Z's families, right? People that they know and they love. And so I think I could see where younger Catholics in particular are going to be supportive of the Harris-Walz ticket because they care about really taking care of immigrants, or the least of these, right? And we think of going back to the teachings of Jesus. I think that's also something to really bear in mind.
I think it's going to be extremely hard to try to peel away some of those white evangelical voters that are pretty reliable for the Republican Party. On the flip side, though, what we've seen in the past several years is that the non-religious voters, atheists, agnostics, none of the above, that group is also fairly solidly Democrat, but not as much. Like atheists, yeah, overwhelmingly Democratic, but the none of the aboves are maybe one of the other panelists can correct me. It's like 60% or closer to that area for Democrats. But if you can energize those more apathetic voters, Democrats would have a lot easier time trying to pick up those voters and get them excited, which they've been doing a good job of so far, but they could do even more and try to bring them into voting for them because on values, on ideas, they're fairly in line, then trying to reach out to white evangelicals. That said, kudos to groups like Evangelicals for Harris, Christians for Harris, which I don't know how much of a dent they're going to make in those numbers, but like people have been saying, if you could peel away a tiny fraction of those white evangelical voters, that goes a long way. But I think there's a bigger gain to be made by trying to pick up the apathetic voters and energize them because they weren't going to vote for anybody. They were probably going to stay at home on election day. You probably have a larger group of them that you can mobilize if you put some effort into it. And that's what I have been seeing in the past couple of weeks from the Harris campaign.
I think, obviously, we do not have a lot of data on Hindu American voters, but it's definitely something to watch out for, especially this year. I mean, we've seen in data support drop for Biden actually over the years since 2020, and that's partly in part because of the way that he's openly criticized the Indian government, and Narendra Modi, the prime minister there. And I think it's very interesting to watch for Kamala Harris in particular, because she has not necessarily, reached out to the Indian or Hindu voting bloc as such, as kind of part of her identity. And I think that's getting mixed reviews. Some are saying, she has Indian heritage. She should be a little bit more active in the community. But then some are saying, these are identity politics. We do not want someone who is just touting her faith or her heritage, just for votes or just to connect to us. I think what's really interesting is that obviously Hindus have leaned Democrat for the majority of the time that they've been in the United States. But what we're seeing is the most increase of political participation of the Hindu American group that we've ever seen. More lawmakers than ever, more political participation than ever, and at the same time, more Republicans than we've ever seen too. We saw it with Vivek Ramaswamy last year, where, he was very open about his Hindu faith, and that didn't necessarily work out in multiple different reasons. But I think that is something really to, and we also have it with JD Vance, Trump's running mate's wife. Her name is Usha Vance, and she is a Hindu in an interfaith marriage as well. And I think, I just would hope that people don't overlook the Hindu American voting bloc. I think that this election is a perfect chance to get to know, exactly what they're looking for as far as foreign policy, as far as economics, as far as, things that could really sway either way for the group.
Thank you. I wonder, this is one for Senator Kim or Broderick, or maybe both of you, one after the other. You decide who goes first. We're hearing about this sort of, evangelicals for Kamala Harris, with Catholics for Harris, and I just wonder if what the danger is in that, really, because if she gets into the White House, actually, they need to be holding her to account. Is there a danger that in all this enthusiasm, they get too close, and then, then they've got to sort of pull back and say, hang on, what about your policies? Senator Kim, I don't know if you want to start with that, and then Broderick.
I've seen this particularly with the Black church in general. And, so as a Black Christian priest, the Black church has been very supportive of me and my own races. And I think that they've taken this idea of like, if we support you in your race, if we support you in getting to the place of being a policy maker, then we can actually better hold you account because we're actually friends. And so there is that danger in that people could be co-opted. But I think particularly for those who are well practiced in the art of both supporting and then holding accountable, being on the friend side, being like, I helped you get in office is actually a much more powerful way of influencing politics than being on the other side of like, I hated you from the beginning and I didn't help you. And I think this is manifested. I've thought a lot about the protests that are happening at the DNC, and we did not see those protests at the RNC. And it's because, quite frankly, the RNC isn't going to do anything reasonable or good on the issue of Palestine. And so what you have is very active, engaged people who are very much saying there's one party that we have even an ounce of hope will be able to stop a genocide, and it's the Democratic Party. So we're going to hold them account. They're still showing up. Be clear, there are delegates who are going to vote for Kamala Harris to become the nominee, right? Who will also then hold her accountable on the issue of Palestine. So I think this is much more an issue of like, let's be friends. Let's get close to one another. That way I can tell you even more clearly and with you understanding that this is not a hate relationship, right? This is about trying to do this well together. And so I don't think, I'm not concerned about people not being able to hold her accountable just because they've been incredibly encouraging. In fact, I think she'll be more open to hearing their critiques than if they've just been against her the whole time.
It's funny because in being here with a UK media outlet, it's a funny little difference in our systems that it appears that because we're a two-party system that we're not a coalition system. But the very fact that we are a two-party system makes us inherently coalition oriented. And that's why the Republican Party can have an element of secular voters and citizens who are not religious at all, who are there because of economic policies, and very conservative, socially conservative religious voters who are there because of social policies. And there are similar coalitions in the Democratic Party, that there are people who are voting for Democrats because of abortion, women's reproductive health, access to equitable education, housing, and labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People are in the party from lots of different corners, lots of different places of value, LGBTQ rights. So lots of us are there for many, 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 many different reasons. And that is the same case for religious voters, that some have one particular angle for their support of Harris, others have another particular angle. And as the senator said, these angles not only motivate people to vote, but they motivate people to keep their candidates accountable to the reason that they were elected in the first place.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on the back of the excellent point that that Mehta made about non-religious voters as a part of the Democratic coalition, also picking up on what Broderick was talking about with coalitions. So people who don't affiliate with a religion, who say they have no religion, make up now fully 30% of the U.S. adult population, and they make up a bigger share than that of Democratic voters. 40% or more of Democratic voters don't identify with any religion. But that group is now so big that it really begs for some disaggregation. And in fact, atheists and agnostics are as strongly Democratic as white evangelical Protestants are Republican. They're not 60% Democratic. They're more like 75 or 80% Democratic. And also atheists and agnostics turn out at the polls in proportion or even higher proportion than they make up a share of the U.S. population. But there's another big group that's unaffiliated, and those are the folks you might think of as religiously indifferent. In polling terms, they're the people we call nothing in particular, not because they don't identify as atheist or agnostic, they just say they have no particular religion. And that group includes a sizable share of people who are just indifferent to religion. It's not that they're turned off by it. In fact, many of them say they believe in God, but they don't go to church or temple or mosque or anything else. And they're sort of disengaged, and they have lower levels of education, and they have lower levels of voting. So one of the things is that white evangelical Protestants lean strongly Republican, and they tend to turn out in high numbers as equal to their proportion of the electorate. Atheists, agnostics, the same thing on the Democratic side, but the nothing in particular is the religiously indifferent, who skew young, lower educated, who are somewhat disengaged, you may think of them as suspicious, skeptical voters, skeptical about everything, cut off from American institutions as a whole, not just religion. That group tends not to vote. And that's, at least in proportion to the numbers. And that's one of the really important things here for the Democratic coalition, whether they'll be able to engage that group.
I suppose the question, and it's a question I'll come back to actually, is about, what motivates people to vote. Whether, you've mentioned the enthusiasm, whether it's enthusiasm or fear. Let's come back to that, because you've got a question, Michael, or a comment.
Thanks, Rosie. I'd really like to get the panel's opinion on the very different understandings of Christianity that can be represented in this debate. For example, there's a lot of evangelical Christians in the States who are passionate Trump supporters, and a lot of people on the other side who would be thinking, well, Trump doesn't really represent Christianity to us. So I'm wondering why the passionate evangelicals are so passionate. Perhaps you could explain that to me.
For a large number of white American Christians, their vision of Jesus is that, or their vision of this country is that we should all adhere to their version of Jesus Christ and their version of Christianity and their version of the church, which is socially conservative, anti-LGBTQ, repressive of the rights of women. And these ideas come from a very specific and particular interpretation of the Bible. So for many of them, and then for those who are not as hard right, they're willing to make the compromise on, some might even say, the fascist nature of Donald Trump and the more recent move of the Republican Party for one thing only, or two things only, and that's being anti-gay marriage and anti-woman's right to choose. So they're willing to accept everything else that's kind of a moral compromise for one or two issues.
I want to jump in this. I wanted to say this earlier. I think that the driver, when we are talking about white evangelicals, the word that we need to latch onto is actually white, because evangelicals, Black evangelicals, Latin evangelicals are not in that same camp. The actual driver is not religion that distinguishes white evangelicals from other people. It is white. It is whiteness that is the driver. It's the distinguisher. And, so I grew up evangelical. My parents are deeply embedded in the Black evangelical church. And they will vote Democrats until they die, right? And so I just want to make sure that we really highlight that there is a racial component here that has something to do with preserving whiteness, about making sure, some of these policies around women's reproductive rights, it's not actually about women's reproductive rights. It's about making sure that white women have babies to continue to make the majority. And white evangelicals have been honest about that. I'm not saying anything that they haven't said out loud themselves. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure that there are white babies that can grow up and continue to be powerful people, right? This is about continuing to conserve and preserve white power, and specifically white male power. And that is, it's dressed up around some Christian principles or ideas. But again, the driver is not Christianity. It is not evangelicalism. It is whiteness.
I know, Melissa, Robbie Jones has written a lot about that in his books on white Christian nationalism, hasn't he? And he's absolutely sort of said, and the fear of the evangelicals is that they're losing demographically. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you, Senator. I think that what the Senator said is very true. We found in our research at PRI, we track the spread of white Christian nationalism in the country. And if you look at people who are likely to hold those viewpoints, these are Americans who think that, largely white Americans, not all white, but largely, who think that, America was founded as a Christian nation and should remain a Christian nation. But if you look at the correlates to those attitudes, Christian nationalists are far more likely to hold high levels of racial resentment. They're far more likely to hold patriarchal views. They're far more likely to be opposed to immigrants, to think that immigrants are coming to change our culture. They believe in the Great Replacement theory at far higher levels than other Americans. And I think really what binds those individuals is a fear that they're being replaced, right? That essentially, demographically, there are far fewer white Christians in the country. And so what you're seeing is a reactionary sort of politics. And the reason, to tie it back to Trump, is that they have, I think, latched on to Donald Trump, despite his own personal moral failings in many ways, is that he is really, really to give them power and give them voice. That he has been a champion for the policies that they espouse. It's really a transactional relationship when it comes down to it. White evangelicals are firmly in the camp of Trump, by and large, because he's been willing to enact policies to appoint Supreme Court justices who are willing to change the policies that they've been advocating for a long time.
To Michael's point, I don't think there's a single white evangelical megachurch in the country, not even a megachurch. I don't think there's a white evangelical church in the country that would ever choose Donald Trump to be their pastor. But over the past couple of years, white evangelical has become much more of a political label than a religious one. And like people have said, it is transactional more than anything. They have said about Trump what they never said about previous Democratic presidents, which is that, oh yeah, we're not electing a pastor. We don't care about what he does. The hypocrisy doesn't bother them. It is transactional. They get judges, they get Supreme Court appointments, they get a guy who will speak the culture war language but doesn't believe a word of it. And of course it's hypocritical. This is why more and more Christians, especially younger ones, are kind of backing away from that. But you know what? It's kind of amazing to see that I mean, Donald Trump has done more for atheism than I think anyone in my movement ever has. So keep it going, man.
I think some of the other speakers have done a good job of explaining how liberals and non-evangelicals would understand what evangelicals are doing. If it's of any help, maybe the contribution I could make would be to maybe say a word about how evangelicals themselves see this, and absolutely take the senator's point of view. Race is definitely a part of this. So I'm talking about white evangelical Protestants here, but I'm unlikely, or I'm a little uncomfortable characterizing anybody's religious beliefs as false and not, I just tend to lean toward the view that we should take what people say about themselves and their beliefs seriously. And if we do that, and we look at what white evangelical Protestants say about the reasons they support Donald Trump, it is not that they think that Donald Trump is a highly moral or highly religious person. We can see in our polling that they don't. They have qualms about they don't think he's highly religious, and some will express qualms about his morality. However, what they will say overwhelmingly is that he stands up for people with their beliefs. So if you want to understand from their, in their eyes, what they're thinking, they see him as someone who stands up for their beliefs. And if you want to see them as hypocritical or think they're not really religious or whatever, that's your business, but that's not how they see themselves.
Thank you. Well, we strayed along sort of a little bit away from the Democrats onto sort of, the religious picture in America generally. I'm going to end with a question, and it might be the senator and Broderick again who just briefly answer this, but it does appear, as it does in this country too, that there's an increasing sort of polarization in our society. And given, what can churches and faith groups do? Almost whatever the outcome of the presidential election, what's the road that they've got to go down in sort of trying to bridge some of these massive divides that have opened up in American society? Broderick, and then the senator, maybe.
Deliver on the promises made, obviously, in this election cycle. And continue to be positive. That much of what Meta said, it's so amazing, everything you said so far, that there is a vision of this country that is not monolithic, that there is room for non-religious and people of no faith and no affiliation, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jews, atheists, agnostics. There is a vision of this country that is multiracial, multi-faith and non-faith, multi-cultural, that is positive and affirmative and focused on the future. And there is a vision of this country that is the antithesis of that. And as long as we're focused on the first, people will continue to be mobilized, engaged, and understand that they themselves are the movement.
Yeah, when I think about the role of the church in particular in this kind of critical point in American history, I really think that the church has a responsibility to talk about values and the ways that those values really do transcend any religion, right? That there's something that, certainly I root in the story of Jesus, but my wife, who is Muslim, she finds the same values that we share to be rooted in a different religion, right? But I think that if we talk about values and about the hope that comes from living out those values for all people, that actually is the big tent that people need to hear about, right? And so, when I think about a particular value, so the love of your neighbor, and neighbor being all people. If we can lead from that place of loving our neighbor, regardless of immigration status, regardless of Democrat or Republican, regardless of status, if we can live into that fully, I think that's a compelling message that will ultimately transform the culture of of the United States and transform it beyond. It'll also transform the parties themselves, right? Like if we can go back to a values-based place. And so that's my hope, I think, for the church especially, but for religious people in general, that we would kind of really begin to call on our better selves, call on our parties, our political parties, but also just as individuals to live into our better selves. So these deeper held values, the things that we teach our 3-year-olds to, to share well, right? To be kind, to do unto others as you would have them to do unto. I think if we can live into those things, then we can see major transformations where the least of these are not left out. And so that's my hope for all of us, not just the church, but for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, so much. I'm sure we're going to want to return to a lot of these things in the run-up to November. That's just been such an enjoyable and interesting hour. I'm grateful to you for taking the time, and goodbye for now.